So it seems that the Emperor has rewarded his faithful with a fun and powerful looking codex. Let's talk about some very zealous battle sisters in this review of Codex Adepta Sororitas. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're talking Sisters of Battle, and in this video I thought we'd do a full overview of the new Codex, the 10th edition book for the Defenders of the Imperial Faith. As you can probably tell from the intro, I think it's really quite a good one. Games Workshop has had a bit of a trend of writing some very boring Imperial Codexes for the previous 3 of them, though it seems that they've broken that now. Also really quite exciting and impactful buffs to the units, 4 detachments that at first glance all genuinely look like they have something cool to offer and different playstyles for the army, and in general I suspect that the book will be kind of well received. In terms of the contents for the book, we've got the lore and miniature galleries, the crusade content, and the combat patrol rules, though today I'm going to focus on the match play rules for the book, How to Play Sisters of Battle in 10th edition. Here we've got the Acts of Faith rule, substituting in the miracle dice, 4 detachments, each with 4 enhancements and 6 stratagems, maybe a little bit fewer than some of the other armies out there, but they genuinely look like 4 good ones, and 4 good ones is better than a whole myriad of bad ones. And then we've got the datasheet section with the new jump Canoness, there are a few Ministorum units removed including Crusaders, Death Cult Assassins, and some Priest datasheets being consolidated. As ever with these 10th edition codexes, the printed points section is redundant at launch. Games Workshop will release them in a digital download very shortly, and I'll certainly look forward to covering that here on the channel. Let's jump straight in though, and we'll talk about the Acts of Faith first, then go through the detachments, and then go through the datasheets. The Sisters Miracle Dice rule has been kind of intact in its similar sort of form for quite a while now. I genuinely think that it's really quite a good rule, bringing a bit of fun and an unusual mechanic to the dice system of Warhammer 40k, representing the Emperor intervening in their battles and occasionally turning blows aside or making one powerful shot ring true. In the Codex it's basically the same as in the Index. You gain 1 miracle dice at the start of each turn, and each time an Adepta Sororitas unit is destroyed, so there's a couple of other ways that you can generate them, and then as before you roll the dice and then set them off to the side in your miracle dice pool. Ideally you want to roll higher, not lower. Then as you acquire the miracle dice, you can plug them into dice rolls. You can use them to influence an advance roll, battle shock test, charge roll, damage roll, hit roll, saving throw, and wound roll. Each unit can do 1 act of faith per phase normally, unless you're playing one specific detachment, but you can do as many miracles as you want in any one phase. It's not limited on an army-wide level. When you're about to make one of those rolls, you can instead choose to plug in one of the miracle dice from your pool. So say if you had a 4 in the pool, you could put that into a wound roll to make sure that it guarantees a success. Or maybe use a 6 to pass an unlikely and vulnerable saving throw, which could be kind of big against a massively high damage weapon. If the roll is a 2d6 roll, you can only substitute one of the dice, not both of them, before rolling. In general, it just remains a very massively powerful mechanic. The 6s are the bits that tend to be really valuable. You can get things like automatic lethal hits on the hit roll, automatic damage results of a 6, automatic long charges or advances if you need to guarantee that you make an unlikely long assault on an enemy, and saving throws can be big as well. One of the themes it seems in the Codex update is there's quite a lot of places where you can throw away some junk miracle dice. A lot of character datasheets have rules where if you discard a miracle dice they get a more powerful ability of some sort, like more than Val. So even if you do roll some 1s, they're still going to have value, and overall I think that the faction mechanic is really quite strong and interesting, and to be honest I'm fairly glad that it's unchanged. Moving on to the new stuff though, let's talk detachments. As mentioned, there's 4 of them. The Army of Faith, which is very miracle focused and has some good support from the exemplars of the Sisters' Faith in the Seraphim and Zephyrim. There's then the Penitent Host, which are for Repentia, Arcoflagellants, and Penitent engines. A bit of a niche datasheet set there, but it genuinely gives them some pretty scary support. The Bringers of Flame are kind of similar to old school Ardent Shroud. Melter and Flamer weapons get strength buffs up close, and you get to advance move towards the enemy. It seems fairly similar to the Space Marine Firestorm Assault Force, which is generally quite well received. And then we've got the Hallowed Martyrs detachment, the sort of Order of Our Martyr Lady themed one, all about sisters sacrificing their lives for the Emperor, and getting some big damage boosts as they do so. None of the detachments lock out any units, so you can take any army in any of them, though some like the Penitent Host will certainly get on with some units better than others. For the detachments though, it's quite nice to see basically 3 different ones that are really quite general purpose, and they're not really too locked to any one datasheet, even if some things might be a little bit preferred. I feel like it's maybe a bit of a weakness for some of the codexes in 10th edition in that they seem to take the detachments down helping out specific datasheets rather than having something that helps out a core force of Sisters of Battle and you can play with the same army differently. Let's jump straight into them though and start out with some Melter and Flamer fire with the Bringers of Flame. As I said, this one feels kind of Argent Shroud, and it basically copies the homework of the Space Marine Firestorm Assault Force. All your units get the Assault Weapon keyword, so you get to advance and shoot, and if you get your weapons within 12 inches, you get +1 to their strength. As with the Space Marines, this is pretty much optimal on close range shooting like Melter and Flamer weapons, which is great news for the Sisters of Battle as that's some of their main damage dealing. And it does seem to back it up with a little bit of love for transport in the stratagem section as well. Advance and shoot is just pretty handy to have. It's great for getting units in position, getting lines of sight, or getting in range of things, and also not compromising on moving towards objectives if you still want to shoot. It's really good for short range weapons in particular, which will struggle with the range. Then for the +1 strength boost, it does depend a bit on what weapon profile you're firing against what unit, but I feel like both Melters and Flamers do have some good breakpoints. Melter weapons generally go from strength 9 to strength 10, which is really good against some standard battle tanks and it'll wound Terminators on 2s. And it means that Sisters of Battle Flamers are just absolutely savage. Hand Flamers will be all the way up at strength 5, which is kind of crazy, really nasty for Seraphim there. Regular Ministorum Flamers are strength 6 and Heavy Flamers strength 7. It's pretty handy that you can do this out of reserve as well, so you could have Retributors turning up out of strategic reserve or Seraphim jumping down from the sky. And between the two, it just means that you've got a fast and extra savage shooting army. As with the rest of these detachment rules, they'll basically be instead of the Hallowed Martyrs damage squad buffs, you'll only get that one in that specific detachment now. In general though, I'd probably rate this one as an upgrade. It's something that will be directly helpful to a whole bunch of units right out of the gate, rather than having to hope that your opponent tries and fails to kill units. Let's take a look at the stratagems next. And interestingly, 5 out of the 6 of these are battle tactic stratagems, which is particularly relevant given that Canonesses can get them for free now, both the jump one and the regular one. This, as a result, seems like an excellent attachment to run Canonesses in. First up, we've got Righteous Blows, which allows you to get lethal hits in melee, and if you slay an enemy model, then the enemy takes a battle shock test. Having lethal hits that you can flex into is just great on all sorts of things. Zephyrim can already get it now, but it means that you can get it with sustained hits and not have to expend miracle dice. The mid-strength, strength 6 Repentia will really like it, and to be honest, none of the Sisters units are really stand out strong in terms of strength characteristic in melee. Even Paragon suits with Warblades could get some good value against vehicles with it. Pretty excellent and means that there's no support for melee in this detachment either. There's one command point for Shield of Aversion, which is essentially Sisters of Battle Armor of Contempt. This one worsens AP by 1 in any one phase, and that's quite nice with Sisters that generally tend to rely on their high saves to stay alive. It'd be really nice with Paragon suits in particular. The 2+ save will really love that, particularly if they can get cover. And it might be interesting with the Imagifier as well, which now gives you a 2+ save just at base. If you've got Shield of Aversion and cover on the go, then that's going to be an abnormally tanky Battle Sister squad. For one command point, there's Cleansing Flames, which again is a battle tactic. Torrent weapons gain devastating wounds. At first glance, that looks like it's probably going to be best on a big 10-woman squad of Seraphim. You could have 8 Hand Flamers all hitting at strength 5 jumping down from the sky, or they could even have a jump Canoness attached to use this stratagem completely for free. Napkin Math says that does around about 5 devastating wounds or so. Seems pretty savage given how many saves you're likely to stack on the enemy as well. Next up, we've got a transport one called Carry Forth the Faithful. Units can disembark even after a transport advanced. That one feels handy enough, I guess. I suppose the transport could still be doing some shooting of its own in this detachment. Quite nice for an immolator, perhaps. And it does mean that your unit could get kind of spectacularly far across the board, particularly if you fed a miracle dice into the advance roll. Seems usable enough if you can get Melters or Flamers onto objectives along with the transport's firepower. Though admittedly the squads still have quite a long threat range to do that if you just disembark and then move and advance and shoot normally, I guess. For 1 CP, there's Rites of Fire, which is another battle tactic, another transport one, this one where the unit getting out of the transport shoots an enemy on an objective within 12 inches and gets +1 to the wound roll. Again, if you slay a model, it triggers a battle shock test if that's helpful. Quite a nice damage boost that one, maybe seems like a good one for Retributors or Dominions on paper. +1 strength and +1 to wound seems like a fairly savage combination on a bunch of multi-melters. Then finally for 1 CP we've got Blazing Ire. This one's a copy of a Firestorm Force stratagem where the transport gets shot, then the unit inside immediately disembarks and fires back at the thing that shot your transport. A bit more of a situational one that's maybe more in your opponent's control. Depending on what's in the transport and what we're shooting it though, it could be a great idea. Overall, some really very solid stratagems there, I think. I particularly like the Righteous Blows and Shield of Aversion, both of them seem great. Cleansing Flames seems really nice on Handflamer Seraphim, and I guess you're likely to have a fair few special weapon units jumping out of transports of one sort or another with these 3 stratagems here. Finally, we've got the Bringers of Flame enhancements. I have listed the printed points cost for these, though they could change. Fire and Fury is 20 points. This one is a damage boost enhancement, giving you a shooting buff of 1 extra hit with torrent weapons or sustained hits 1 with everything else shooting. Seems great on any character in a unit with at least some firepower. Again, could even be used on a jump pack Canoness with those Handflamer Seraphim if you really wanted more torrent hits. In reality, maybe it's going to be a bit better on something like some Repentia perhaps. With a Palatine you could have both sustained and lethal hits going off at the same time. For 10 points there's Righteous Rage. You can discard up to 3 Miracle Dice for +1 attack and strength to the bearer's melee weapon profile. That does feel like something that's probably not the best use of Miracle Dice really. I guess in the right combat if it does make the difference of +1 to wound, then it's probably good value for a cheap one. On paper you could get a jump Canoness up to some very scary stats here, though depending on what else you've got you might already have some very good targets for throwing low Miracle Dice into. Next up we've got the Manual of Saint Griselda for 15 points. This one can be another option to burn through some low Miracle Dice. At the start of each command phase you get to combine 2 Miracle Dice into 1 by adding their numbers together to get to a maximum of 6. I guess if you wanted to just maximise the amount of 6s that you could throw at melter weapons, getting damage results or automatic lethal hits and things, then that could be a nice way of doing so. Seems like a reasonable enough option for manipulating them. Finally, just listed for 5 points here is the Iron Surplus of Saint Estelela. This one's a 2+ save and a 5+ feel no pain for a Canoness or Palatine. That's an alright durability boost, I suppose. That seems absolutely fine for 5 points as a points filler. Both a high save and a feel no pain could genuinely be enough to help them survive a round of firepower and maybe have one more turn of doing stuff. Overall, just seems like a very strong detachment all around. Nice easy buffs for some of the best sisters weapons around, extra speed and extra damage, some good melee support, plenty of help for transport vehicles, and a few usable enhancements, though I wouldn't say they're probably the strongest part of the detachment. I'm sure there'll be plenty of people enjoying putting the Melters and Flamers to work in this one. Next up, just in case your Sisters of Battle weren't quite faithful enough, we've got the Army of Faith. This allows all Sisters units on the board to perform 2 acts of faith per phase rather than 1. It's similar to one of the boosts on the Triumph of St. Catherine's relics, but applied to the entire board all the time. I feel like this one is potentially very strong on paper. It means if there's just one critical unit on the map that's got a really good chance of dealing some massive damage to the enemy, you could focus multiple miracle dice on it, like making sure that your melter both hits and wounds, or guarantee 1 wound and then punch a massive amount of damage through. And it seems like this one will get along really well with the Dialogus rules, who can still turn your miracle dice into automatic 6s. I feel like it's the kind of detachment where if you absolutely know how to get the very best out of the miracle dice, then it's probably going to do well. But maybe if you're a bit less experienced, maybe less so much, you still actually need to spend all those miracle dice. And it might be that you could have got some pretty good value out of them just by spreading them out over multiple different units rather than focusing them all on one. It just gives you more options for spending them, though a few of the options in the detachment do give you some chances to generate more. It might be particularly nice to get a few more things that can generate miracle dice onto the table as well, maybe things like Battle Sister squads with the Simulacrums perhaps. Moving on to the stratagems, and first up they've got Divine Guidance, which is a battle tactic. This one gives you an extra pip of AP either when shooting or when fighting, and that's often just really valuable just in and of itself, particularly if you've got a big meaningful damage dealer that's trying to take down something with a high save. On top of that though, if you also manage to destroy an enemy model, then you generate a miracle dice, and if you can trigger both of those meaningfully at the same time, then that's really big value all combined. Next up, we've got one of several that are an interesting sort of aura ability. You can just use it on any one unit, though probably the most powerful way to use it is on a unit of Seraphim or Zephyrim. If you target a jump pack unit with this stratagem, then they get a 3-inch aura of getting the buff around them. A Shield of Faith gives your units a 5+ feel no pain against mortal wounds, so that could apply to a good chunk of your central army. Reactive defense against mortal wounds is rarely going to be the worst thing, maybe particularly nice if you're playing against Thousand Suns and they're throwing a bunch of doom bolts about. Maybe a little bit more limited in scope now devastating wounds aren't mortal wounds these days though. Still quite a nice one to have, given that Sisters are fairly vulnerable to mortal wounds, given low wound count on the models and generally relying on high saves. Next up for 1 CP we've got Light of the Emperor, which is a battle tactic. You trigger this one in the command phase to make a unit blessed, and then it ignores any changes to weapon skill or ballistic skill, or any modifiers to rolls outside of saves. Again, if you can put that on a jump pack unit, then they can give it to multiple other things in a 3-inch aura. I guess maybe that could be most reliably useful if you're shooting against something with things like -1 to hit or wound on the go, and you can use this to buff a bunch of units to overcome those barriers. There are plenty of places where this theoretically could be useful though. It's more depending on what your opponent is bringing to the table in terms of debuff things. I guess could potentially help out Exorcists as well, overcome the -1 to hit from firing indirect. Next up, for 1 command point, we've got Faith and Fury, which is another battle tactic. This one gives you Lance in the fight phase, and again, if you slay any models, then you gain 1 miracle dice. Again, scary stuff on most of the Sisters of Battle units here. This will make Repentia absolutely savage. They could have sustained hits, reroll the hit roll, reroll the wound roll, and +1 to wound all on the go, and all for just 1 CP. Generating the miracle dice just takes this from already quite good to absolutely great. Next up, for 1 command point, there's Blinding Radiance, which is -1 to hit this unit, and again you can put it out in an aura around a jump pack unit. This one does seem like quite a nice one if your army is advancing against an enemy gun line, make everything just that little bit tougher to put down to long range shooting. It's never really going to be a bad option to have a reactive -1 to hit though if you just need a bit more durability for any one unit. Finally, last but not least, we've got Angelic Descent. At the end of the enemy fight phase, you get to return a jump pack unit to reserves. The only restriction is that you can't use it for units in engagement range. This one's super nice for Seraphim, being able to get to places they shouldn't be able to on the board with their move shoot move thing. Really helpful to be able to have multiple small units bounce around the board, maybe doing secondary objectives and things, while the rest of the army does its thing. And it could be a really nice late game as well to threaten maybe their enemy's home field. Just another good reason to keep a good amount of Seraphim and maybe Zephyrim around. Overall, solid stratagems, handy enough to have a couple of durability ones that can happen in auras, and the lance and extra AP ones both seem really usable and come with bonus miracle dice baked in. Finally, we've got the enhancements, the Blade of St. Eleanor being 10 points and slightly adjusted from how it was in the Hallowed Martyrs detachment. The Hallowed Martyrs detachment basically still has the Blade of St. Eleanor, but it's just been renamed. This one's more or less a new relic with the same name. This version gives you +1 strength and +1 AP to your bearer's melee attacks though, which is nice enough on a power weapon, maybe a jump canoness. Those attacks gain precision, so could be used to snipe out enemy leaders from units, and also if you happen to destroy any enemy models, then you gain miracle dice. Between the three, if you do have the points left over and you've got a fighty canoness or palatine or something, seems reasonable enough for the upgrade. If it does stay that cheap, seems good. Litanies of Faith is another old one that's been moved to this detachment and then given a new ability. This one is for either a Canoness or Palatine, and then in each of your command phases they test leadership. If they roll a 7 or more on the dice, which is their base leadership, they'll get. Then they generate a miracle dice, so you could usually expect around about 3 over the course of the game outside of any sort of leadership manipulation. I guess you just need to make sure they're on the board and keep testing. If you've got any cheap support character sat around and not pushing out to an enemy in a transport or something, then this seems like it could be a pretty reasonable addition for them. Next up and listed at just 5 points is Divine Aspect. In your movement phase, an enemy unit within 12 inches takes a battle shock test, and if it's failed then you gain a miracle dice. Probably a good thing that that one's quite so cheap as it is pretty low yield. Most of the time they are going to pass the test for most units, but I feel like if any unit ever does fail a test, then it's more than justified its existence at 5 points, maybe worth it on something that's moving forward towards the enemy, and you are likely to be getting within 12 inches of the enemy at least once fairly early in the game. Finally enlisted for 20 points is the Triptych of the Macarian Crusade. It means if you substitute a miracle dice for a saving throw for the bearer, then that saving throw will be passed regardless of the value of that miracle dice. So basically means that you auto pass even if it's on a 1, and I guess in this army you could do it multiple times in the same phase to bounce a bit of damage. It's genuinely not awful, but I'm not really sure it's worth 20 points really. If the character squad is dead, then a lot of their purpose is probably already gone. Plus you would have to burn the miracle dice, which you could certainly have lots of other good homes for in the Sisters of Battle roster. I feel like if anything this one probably should have been one of the cheaper ones given the need to spend miracle dice to make it work. Overall though, the Army of Faith does look like a very scary detachment. You do have some very nice options with basically guaranteeing damage output out of multi-melters and things. I really like the extra AP and the lance attacks. They're both good damage dealers in their own right, but coming with extra miracle dice generation is great. And the ignores modifiers and -1 to hit on the aura things are nice. I like the ability to return Seraphim and things to reserve. On the enhancements, the Blade and the Litanies of Faith both seem like probably the better picks out of them, and for 5 points Divine Aspect is absolutely fine as well. Overall, again, does look like a very strong detachment, though one that's all play a bit differently. I feel like it's almost bound to be a fairly interesting one, leaning so heavily into the fun core mechanic of the army. Next up, we've got the Rage of the Penitent Host. As mentioned earlier, this one is the one that focuses on the Penitent keyword models, a new keyword given to the Archoflagellants, the Repentia, the Penitent Engines, Mortifiers, and also the Ministorum Priest. At least in the past, these have all been solid enough datasheets. I feel like given the changes to Repentia, they're looking even better than they were. But regardless, this detachment has some really good stuff for all of them. The core rule is Desperate for Redemption. It's basically like the Space Marine combat doctrines. You have 3 different turns where you get good stuff. This good stuff only applies to the Penitent keyword models, and you can use each of the buffs once. It does only apply to the Penitent models, not Penitent units unfortunately, so you can't use the Ministorum Priest to get this on other unlikely things that they can join. The first of the buffs is a +3 inches to your movement boost. This gives you an absolutely enormous threat range for charging melee units. Penitent engines already move fast and can advance and charge already, so this is yet further for them. Never mind if you start putting miracle dice into advance or charge rolls. Seems like it's great for a turn where you just need to make some really long charges and utterly rush the enemy. Maybe on a turn where you're caring more about actually reaching the enemy and making the charge, and you already think that you've got enough damage when you get there. If you do need more damage though, then the turn for the +1 strength and +1 attack is going to be a big one. This one's a pretty enormous boost to damage output, strength 6 Archoflagellants or strength 7 Repentia. The +1 attack's probably the biggest thing, and particularly for Repentia, which is an enormous buff to them. Certainly doesn't hurt on the rest though. Finally, there's a counter melee one, Fight on Death on a 2+ for all these Penitent units if they've not already fought this phase. This would be the one to line up if you think the opponent's going to be charging you this turn, and it means that you could get a whole load of damage and revenge as they take down your desperate sinners. And I guess you'd have to weigh up quite carefully whether or not it's going to make more difference to get a movement or damage buff on your turn or get this on the enemies. You do have to declare these rules at the start of the battle round, so not at the start of your turn. And that does mean that the opponent, if they're going first, might be able to see what you're doing all game and basically know whether or not it's extra movement or extra damage coming for your next turn. Either way though, it seems like a really fun and very powerful rule. It's definitely going to be a detachment that's dependent on the Penitent units being good though, of course. Moving on to the stratagems, and for 1 command point we've got Passion of the Penitent. This one's a battle tactic, and it gives you critical hits on a 5+ in melee for a Penitent unit. This might not make all that much sense until you know they've all got sustained hits, including Mortifiers and Repentia now. So on its own it usually equates to a 25% damage buff if you were hitting on a 4+ before. Not awful, but certainly not crazy on its own. It can get kind of crazy though if you add a Palatine to the mix, as we'll get onto. For 1 command point, there's Final Redemption. This is a sticky objective type rule that triggers when your unit's destroyed while holding an objective. The unit gets shot down, and then the unit gets to use this, and the objective will remain under your control. If the enemy's got nothing nearby, this one could be a pretty reasonable option to make sure that the objective stays yours and gives them problems with how to take it later. For 1 command point, Purity and Suffering gives you a 4+ Feel No Pain for Penitent units. This would be standout awesome on most of the Sisters range, though it's a bit more just okay on regular Penitent units. They now all have a 5+ Feel No Pain, so going from a 5 to a 4 is usually more like a 33% durability boost against things that care. It'll be less than that against anything that's super high damage and was going to overkill the model anyway. Still though, really quite good against anything that's damage 1 in particular, and a bit more general purpose for things like Mortifiers and Penitent engines that get really quite tanky with this. Then for 1 CP we've got Lash of Guilt. This one allows a Penitent unit to advance and charge, and combined with that 3-inch extra move that you can get on one big turn, you can have units go a fairly massive way across the board. Even standard Repentia moving 7 inches could have +3 from that core rule, and then we'll be making an average charge of something like 20 to 21 inches, and that's before you've even done things like got out of transports or used a miracle dice to increase either the advance or the charge. It could be downright likely to be charging all the way from one deployment zone to the next potentially. This does look utterly terrifying given how much damage they can do. For Penitent engines specifically, they can already do that, so this makes that advance an automatic 6 inches, so they'll basically get a 14-inch movement and still be able to charge, a 17-inch movement if they're in that plus movement turn. Kind of funny that they can run so fast that they can outpace Eldari jet bikes there. Next up for 1 command point, we've got Boundless Zeal. This one's not locked to Penitent units, and it means that you can fall back and either shoot or declare a charge. If you use it on a Penitent unit, you can do both, relevant for the engines and the mortifiers, I suppose. In general, that's always something that's pretty helpful to have access to. Sometimes it might be the right move to jump out of one combat and jump into another, either because you want to shoot down the thing that you're in combat with, or even just charge in and get a charge benefit. Finally, for 1 CP, there's Devout Fanaticism. This one's a d6-inch surge move type thing, kind of similar to what things like Khorne Berserkers or Tyranids Unending Swarm get. The idea is that your unit is shot, and for most units out there, it's reliant on killing a model, then your unit gets to move d6 inches towards the closest enemy, getting into combat if it can. This one seems to be worded differently and far more powerfully though. For this one, when you even declare shooting on the units, they get to make that surge move. So basically you could say that you're going to shoot this squad of Repentia, and then all of a sudden before you can even line up any shots, they've already moved into combat and started hacking something apart with chainswords. This one really does seem crazy powerful. Would mean that the army is a bit of a nightmare to get to grips with a gunline army that's also trying to contest objectives as you need to in Warhammer 40k, and another big source of strength for the army and a pain to deal with them. Overall, again, this feels like another particularly standout stratagem section. Probably the biggest downside is that it is locked to those Penitent units, so you're very much locked in with just a few datasheets and having to make them work, but loads of these seem standout, particularly the advance and charge I think seems really good. That surge move one is very scary, and the rest all seem like they're pretty strong value in the right situation. Finally, we've got the enhancements for the host. First up, the Psalm of Righteous Judgment is printed at 20 points, and this one seems like a pretty easy auto-include to me. Have one character stand around somewhere on the board and not die, presumably while doing something else useful, and while any Penitent unit on the board slays any enemy unit, you can change one of the miracle dice in your pool to an automatic 6. That's a seriously powerful ability, gaining a bunch more miracle dice that are going to have the absolute maximal effect of really big advances, charges, or wound or damage rules is going to be massive, and if you play in this army, your Penitent units are likely to be killing a whole bunch of enemy units, so you should be able to turn a good chunk of the miracle dice you have on offer to 6s. Next up, we've got the Verse of Holy Piety for 15 points. This one's a Minister and Priest one only. Once per battle, their unit can use another Vow of Atonement in addition to the one that they have active, and this one's declared at the start of the battle round. If it is 15 points, this certainly seems strong enough to be interesting. The Minister and Priest seems absolutely fine to include in the first place for +1 to wounds, and you could have some really fun combos on the go here, potentially the extra movement and then the extra damage on the charge, or perhaps get the extra damage in your turn and then have the fights on death for if the enemy is going to need to charge you back. Certainly seems usable enough to me. Next up for 10 points we've got the Refrain of Enduring Faith. This one's printed at 10 points, and again really feels kind of awesome. The Minister and Priest gives a 5+ invulnerable save to the unit he's leading. This seems really good for Arcoflagellants. They don't have any save to start with, but are still at least somewhat durable due to multiple wounds and the 5+ feel no pain. This feels like it does enough to make them really quite annoying for the enemy to remove once more. That's going to soak up a whole bunch of small arms. Finally, and potentially one of the nastiest ones, is the Catechism of Divine Penitence. This one's printed at a mere 5 points. It basically gives you the option for a Canoness, Palatine, or Priest to attach to a Repentia squad. This one certainly seems like it's going to be best for the Palatine at first glance. It means that the Repentia squad could have lethal hits and sustained hits on 6s, and then if you use the critical hit stratagem to get that on a 5+, it means that all Repentia will get sustained and lethal hits on 5s, and given that they're Repentia, they get to re-roll the hit roll as well, so you'll be getting lots and lots of those absolutely bloodthirsty 5s and 6s. That one does seem like the combo that's far too good to pass up with the sheer amount of damage that could mete out. The other two options don't exactly seem bad though. +1 to wound for Repentia is great, and free stratagems for battle tactics seem like they could be alright as well. The Canoness could allow the Repentia to use the critical hits for free, and any of the characters get to profit from the Repentia's rerolls as well. Whichever way you go with this, the unit's utterly murderous, but probably seems scariest with the Palatine. Overall, for a detachment that's only really working around about 5 datasheets, this one seems to have done very well. The core rule seems fun and has some meaningful choices to be made each turn. The stratagems seem very powerful, particularly advance and charge and the surge move, though the rest is great, and these enhancements literally all seem very usable. At first glance it feels like the choice is which one of these do you choose to leave behind. I guess maybe the verse of Holy Piety at first glance, though depending on exactly what units that you're running, it might depend. Overall does seem really fun. I'd guess that a lot of Sisters of Battle players might not quite have enough of these Penitent style units to use this as a common detachment, but for people who have got a crazy amount of Mortifiers and Repentia and Arco-Flagellants and things, this does look like a pretty fun and brutal way to play with loads of fast melee damage. Finally, we're back to the Index detachment with a new version of the Hallowed Martyrs detachment. This one's basically unchanged since the Index, a detachment that gives you extra damage to injured squads and feels very Our Martyred Lady in theme. If your unit either lost a model or was a single model unit and lost any wounds, you get +1 to hit. Fairly good for big, fairly tanky things like castigators perhaps that might take some chip damage before they get outright destroyed, and really quite nice for anything that the opponent just can't quite kill. It means, say, the last multi-melter in a unit can hit in a particularly stylish fashion. If the unit's below half strength as well, you also get +1 to wounds. Overall, it is a nice rule to have. It definitely will come up over the course of a game, but is somewhat reliant on your opponent failing to finish off units. If they are in a position where they can be really quite careful with their firepower and just wipe things out or don't damage things, you might get no value out of this. For quite a few Sisters Elite damage dealers, they do tend to be kind of fragile as well. They might hit hard and then get removed in return rather than just being damaged but not destroyed. A bunch of the stuff is very similar in the new detachment versus the old. One of the more exciting ones is Divine Intervention for resurrecting a character when they get slain. Spend 1 command point and 1 to 3 miracle dice. Yet they stand back up with that many wounds remaining depending on the miracle dice, and now they get an extra D3 as well. You can't do it on Celestine, it's only once per game per character, and they return at the end of the phase outside of engagement range. Can be very nice if you've got a scary character to do that with, like Morven Val. And it can certainly be worth it on some characters that can hit at least moderately hard in close combat with some fancy power weapons. With the extra D3 wounds restored, it does mean that they're usually going to be above half health, which does mean that potentially they might not have hit quite as hard as they would have done otherwise. Still though, a really good stratagem. For 1 command point, there's Suffering and Sacrifice, which is a battle tactic. This one's got a pretty big buff going from Index to Codex. It now reads that when an enemy unit is engagement range with this infantry unit or walker unit, that unit must select this unit as the target of its attacks. Previously, it was more models in engagement range, in which case you could only limit part of the unit from not attacking something else, but for this one you could have a massive Great Horde unit engaged or a massive Terminator squad, and they would all have to attack your one unit, even the things that couldn't reach. If that is really what they intend and they don't FAQ it or anything, that seems a lot more powerful. It was already potentially quite a good stratagem anyway. You could soak a bunch of damage on a relatively cheap or expendable unit and save something that was far more hard-hitting or dangerous. Though admittedly you don't have quite as many cheap units to activate it with, such as no cheap Crusaders anymore. Otherwise, we've got one called Sanctified Immolation. This one automatically triggers Deadly Demise on one of your units that's been destroyed. It's good for an expendable Rhino, maybe killed in the middle of the enemy army, maybe a little bit on the situational side. For 1 command point, there's Righteous Vengeance, a battle tactic that allows you to reroll hit rolls in melee. You also get to reroll wound rolls too if you're below half strength, though that one's going to be kind of situational. Could be nice enough for something like Zephyrim or Paragon suits that don't already have Val with them. Might be quite a good one for Arco-Flagellants as well. Previously this one was just a flat +1 to wound, which I think probably was a little bit more general purpose, as it really helped you punch up against some tough stuff, but this one's still good. Next up for 2 CP, there's Spirit of the Martyr. This one allows you to fight on death, and it must be activated when your unit is selected to be attacked. It's pricey, but it is helpful, guaranteed damage. In the right situation, it could be worth it if you've got some terrifying melee troops about to be wiped for certain by a big enemy threat. Maybe a nice one for Repentia, perhaps. And then for one command point, there's Praise the Fallen. This one's a return fire one for a unit that lost a model to enemy shooting, and then they immediately get to shoot the targets that attacks them. Occasionally this could be helpful, though it is kind of reliant on the unit that just shot you and killed something not from having done critical damage to your unit to the point where it's not worth returning fire. Maybe it could be nice enough though if you lose a Paragon suit and you still have 2 left, or maybe you lose a Retributor and you still have the rest of the squad. Overall, still some interesting stratagems there, I think. Divine Intervention for the characters is still great. Suffering and Sacrifice got even better if anything, and that's some pretty powerful melee manipulation. The last 3 are maybe situationally fine, the damage one is alright, and I must admit I do quite enjoy exploding vehicles and things. Potentially for a Rhino on its last legs, you could even charge it into something to have it blow up at the optimal location. If you could hand out 5 copies of D3 Mortal Wounds, it could be going out with a big bang. Finally, we've got the enhancements, which are kind of similar to how they were before, though a couple have been renamed. I've listed the printed points costs here, which might be a mistake given that these have got really quite different points costs as they're being updated by balanced data slates, so I guess we'll wait and see where they settle when they give us the Sisters points costs in full. Saintly Example is printed at 5 points. This one gets you D3 Miracle Dice when the bearer is destroyed. This one was used really quite a lot, as D3 Miracle Dice plus the one for losing your character is all very valuable, and there are generally some nice cheap Sisters units to be able to use it on. You can just wander forward, be a nuisance, maybe even get some victory points and objectives if you're lucky, and if the opponent kills the model then you get a big consolation prize. Otherwise, the Chaplet of Sacrifice is printed at 20 points. This one's reroll a miracle dice at each round at the end of the command phase, going up to 3 if the squad that the bearer's in is below starting strength. Previously this one was called Litanies of Faith and it was quite a good one. It's now slightly better than it was before now, as previously the bearer's unit had to be below half strength to get the 3 miracle dice effect. It means that you can be doing a lot of fishing towards getting those super high rolls now. Again, I could still see that one being a bit of a staple. Next up, the Blade of St. Eleanor has been renamed the Far Less Catchy Through Suffering Strength. This one's printed at 10 points, though Games Workshop had put it up to 25 points after balance updates and things. This is the one that gives you +1 strength, damage, and attack to the bearer's melee weapons, and was often used on a Palatine where it could make her into really quite a punchy melee machine. Between this, her lethal hits, and her mortal wound thing, you could get some serious damage on the go. Could also be very good on a regular Canoness or jump Canoness as well now, as both of those might be a bit more tempting with free stratagem things going on. The Blessed Blade got a lot better as well. Finally, we've got the Mantle of Ophelia printed at 15 points. This one makes any enemy damage characteristics become damage 1 for a Canoness or Palatine. If you just absolutely need one of those to survive, then it's worth it, I guess. Given that they're only either 4 wounds or 3 wounds, still doesn't really make them that tough though. I feel like in reality this one's a bit of a waste of points and is worse than any of the others. Overall though, despite strong competition, I still feel like Hallowed Martyrs is going to be an interesting choice. The detachment rule probably isn't the main strength of it, but it still has some good stratagems such as the character revival and suffering and sacrifice, and then several of the enhancements are quite nice, getting you more miracle dice, the Blade of St. Eleanor being renamed, and farming those miracle dice with multiple rerolls, particularly if your squad gets damaged. Overall, at least at first takes, it feels like they've done really well with these detachments, compared with several codexes in 10th edition where there's just a lot of choices that feel sort of like maybe or a bit weak. It generally feels like these ones add big strength in multiple different directions, and it will be interesting to see what winds up being the strongest in terms of actual tournament play and competitiveness. At first instincts, I might have guessed the Army of Faith or perhaps Bringers of Flame, but Hallowed Martyrs still absolutely has great options. And if the Penitent Host datasheets do actually turn out to be some of the strongest in the Codex somehow after the points cost, then that one does have some absolutely enormous support for them. I feel like at the very least all of them are going to be fun to try out, so Sisters players should have a good time experimenting with army lists. Moving on, let's get on to the datasheets though, as really quite a lot has changed for the Emperor's Faithful, and a lot of it for the better. In the Sisters Codex, there's only really one properly new datasheet in the Jump Pack Canoness, and she looks like really quite an interesting and powerful model. Really quite good to see her return as a datasheet, as she was an option that was lost quite a long time ago. Otherwise though, as mentioned earlier with Lost 3 datasheets, the Crusaders and the Death Cult Assassins never made the transition to plastic, and they'll be kind of missed as small independent units that could just be annoying placeholders and action doers and things. Maybe at some point in the distant future Games Workshop might release some plastic kits for them. It'd be quite nice to have them return to the range eventually. Otherwise, the Minister and Priest has consolidated the datasheets both for the Missionary and the Preacher. There's some of the war gear of each of them, though most of the rules more resemble the Preacher out of the two. It does seem that overall it's looking like a more useful model, particularly in the Penitent Host. As ever with these Codex reviews, I would bear in mind that the printed points of the 10th edition codexes just broadly aren't relevant. I think it's worth underlining, as it's not really all that obvious to people who are new or returning to the game. The way that Games Workshop does these things now is that they have some placeholder points written in the codex, and then a QR code to take you to the Munitor and Field Manual, which is the digital download on Warhammer Community. These points will have been determined really quite a long time ago. Quite a lot has changed since then, including lots of balance updates and things, and they're so warped that they won't really be worth paying attention to too much. Mostly I broadly go by the digital points costs. The post-codex points tend to be more close to the digital points cost versus the printed book costs, and they should be on offer from Games Workshop sometime around the dates of the 17th to the 21st of June, unless they surprise us with an earlier or later release. I'll absolutely cover these on the channel when they're out, and it'll be interesting to see how these Sisters units stack up once we have them. My guess would be that there'll probably be a few points increases coming for these units, as most of these were already really quite usable and competitive, but plenty of them have gained some pretty massive boosts to the datasheets, making them a lot scarier. For general datasheet themes for the Sisters of Battle, the only battle line unit is the Battle Sister Squad, so you can take 6 copies of them if you'd like. And while people do generally run them, and often in numbers, it may be usually tended to be somewhere between 1 and 3 squads rather than more than 3. Otherwise, for themes throughout the datasheets, they often have a 3+ armor save to represent their power armor. They retain their 6+ invulnerable saves from the Shield of Faith, which is kind of rarely relevant unless you're hit by really big high AP, like AP4 things or higher. I guess it is nice to know though that you can always pass a saving throw with a miracle dice in a pinch if you need to with a 6. Unlike some editions in the past, Ministorum units aren't excluded from any stratagems or anything like that. They all have the Adepta Sororitas keyword and function as part of the core army. Their standard leadership is a 7+, so a little bit more vulnerable to battle shock than many armies out there. And they've got a few fun common bits of war gear as well. Their signature weapons for dealing damage tend to be melter guns and flamers, so quite a lot of close range shooting and melee. The Ministorum flamers that they get a +1 strength versus the majority of profiles out there, so strength 4 hand flamers, strength 5 regular flamers, and strength 6 heavy flamers, getting even more than this if you're in the Bringers of Flame. The cherubs that they have often recycle a miracle dice, so once you've spent one for the unit once per game you can immediately add another miracle dice to the pool. And with this new version of the Codex there's been a rules change to the Simulacrum Imperialis. For each objective that you have a unit with a simulacrum on it, you get to roll 1 dice. For each 4+ you get a miracle dice, and the miracle dice gets to be the value of that dice roll, so you're guaranteed a 4 or more if you get it. That one's really quite nice and probably means that it's worth having one unit with a simulacrum to camp on your home objective, maybe half of a Battle Sister squad, while the rest of them go trekking off in an immolator or something. Starting out with the units, I thought we'd take a look at the new Jump Canoness with her shiny new model, then go through all the infantry units, then the vehicle units, then the characters, then the epic heroes. The Jump Canoness on first impressions looks like really quite a cool and exciting model. The book printed cost is only 50 points, and I think she'll be very strong if that does turn out to be the case. She can lead Seraphim and Zephyrim, and has a 12-inch move, toughness 3, a 3+ save, only 3 wounds weirdly, leadership 7 and a 4+ invulnerable save. She does have all the keywords that you'd expect, including grenades. Not really sure why she's got 3 wounds when the Canoness and Palatine both have 4 now. Maybe that jetpack's extra fragile or something. For her weapon options, she's got 3 different loadout choices, either a power sword and hand flamer, an eviscerator, or a blessed halberd. All 3 loadouts get AP 2 and damage 2. The power sword is strength 4 and 4 attacks, the eviscerator is strength 6 and 3 attacks with sustained hits, and the halberd is 5 attacks at strength 5. Out of the 3 of them, the halberd I think does just seem to fairly clearly win there. Getting an extra 2 attacks outweighs the sustained hits in my opinion and the +1 strength. The eviscerator does win slightly against a few specific targets like Terminators though. Like the Canoness, she now gets Sacred Command, a free battle tactic stratagem rule, the same as captains or lords in other armies. That one's going to be quite good depending on the detachment. It seems particularly great both for Bringers of Flame and Army of Faith as well. Both of them have some really easy to use damage dealing battle tactics that you might want on Seraphim or Zephyrim. Finally, she's got a really good boosting rule as well called Divine Deliverance. Once per game, she gets an extra 3 attacks and devastating wounds. Even if she is kind of fragile, it's pretty massive to get a crazy 8 attacks at Strength 5, AP 2, and Damage 2, and devastating wounds, all hitting on a 2+. That could easily kill as many points as she's worth in a single round of combat there. And she could potentially get boosts to that as well if she joined a Zephyrim squad, picking up sustained hits or lethal hits, or even both there. Overall, she seems pretty excellent, really. If she remains anywhere near 250 points, and Zephyrim in particular are useful, I feel like she's going to have a good place. Moving on though, let's talk about the infantry units. The standard Battle Sister squad are your rank and file faithful, toughness 3 with a 3+ save and objective control 2. A little bit sturdier than most against really low AP firepower thanks to their armor, but they're still going to be fragile with toughness 3 and 1 wounds. Pre-Codex they were 100 points, and they were pretty common tournament staples, generating miracle dice super easily. They have seen a few changes here. Their Defenders of Faith rule was swapped from generating automatic extra miracle dice to a sticky objectives type rule. So if you hold the objective in your command phase, it remains yours, even if your units are gunned down or you move off it. That is a nice rule to have, admittedly. And then the miracle dice was swapped to the Simulacrum Imperialis as mentioned, which no longer does its previous rule of kill units to generate miracle dice. Otherwise, they get a multi-melter, a melter gun, and some sergeant gear in the unit. They're interesting enough to split in half with an immolator and have some of them guard the home field while some of them go off adventuring. And they can be interesting for character attachment as well. There's some characters that can double attach to them, making quite a big high investment unit. Overall, still seem pretty strong. Still suspect lists are going to take some, maybe more along the lines of perhaps 1 or 2 units rather than 2 or 3 now, though, I'd guess. Next up, the Dominion squad were 110 points pre-Codex. These are the Scouting Special Weapon Sisters. They get the Assault keyword on their bolters and special weapons, so can get them in range extra easily. And Scouting to help them move up the board, help them get in range, they can confer that to a transport vehicle. And interestingly enough, they have a unique special rule called Holy Vanguard, which means if they put a character with them in the same transport, then that character can also scout as well, so they can have some fairly broad character attachments now. Otherwise, they swapped their innate reroll advanced rolls for a reactive movement buff called Righteous Awareness. This one allows them to move d6 inches if the enemy finishes a move within 9, potentially could allow them to retreat back to safety after they've blown something up with some melter weapons. Overall, still seem like a fun unit that can scout up the board and hit the enemy pretty hard early. They're not quite as massively hard hitting as Retributors, but they do have a few more bodies to tank damage in return, maybe just a tiny bit more of a skew towards being a little bit durable versus being all out damage. Talking of Retributors, these are 105 points. They're still the heavy weapon sisters, usually packing either 4 flamethrowers or perhaps more likely 4 multi-melters, and they come with 2 cherubs to allow you to recycle some miracle dice. They got a nice buff in the Codex. They still reroll wound rolls of 1 against everything, but if they target something that's destroyed an Adepta Sororitas unit earlier in the game, they get to reroll all wound rolls, so you might need a few Retributor Judgment tokens to put on units, just to mark what's destroyed one of your units and what hasn't, so you know what the Retributors are going to be very nasty against. That does seem like a really quite scary and powerful rule here. They'll fit right at home with the Bringers of Flame, I'm sure. Getting to advance and shoot, and potentially strength 10 multi-melters are 2 really nice things for them. Next up, we've got some Elite Sisters in the Celestian Sacrosands. These girls really couldn't hit very hard before, and Games Workshop had kept on reducing their points cuts all the way until they were just 12 points per sister. They still have a 3+ save base, but get a 4+ invulnerable save for those shields, and their Swarm Protector rule means they're a little bit more durable than some, getting -1 to wound when a character's leading the unit. It's not just a Palatine or Canoness anymore, it's any character out of any of them. It seems that Games Workshop decided to give them a little bit more punch though. Both profiles of their main weapons were buffed. The Anointed Halberd becomes a bit more volume attacks hitting infantry, getting 3 attacks and sustained hits. The Hallowed Mace gets 3 attacks and lethal hits with its Strength 4 AP1 Damage 2 profile. Both of those are at least fairly well balanced depending on exactly what you want to strike. The maces having a bit more punch against really tough stuff with multiple wounds, the halberds being a bit better with things that have got higher saves or one wound things. Hopefully they'll be given a points cost where they can actually represent the fighting elite of the sisters once more. They were kind of rarely used pre-Codex. Next up, we've got the rather godly Seraphim. 70 points per 5 of them, which gets you 5 jump sisters, usually with quad hand flamers, which tended to be the way that most people went. These are just great skirmish and objective doing units, deep striking, then being able to move, shoot, move to get to unusual positions on the board, and being able to spit out 4d6 strength for flamer type attacks as they went along was a big bonus. Fortunately for them, they're completely unchanged, so good news really, seeing as they were already great. I really like the Bringers of Flame and the Army of Faith detachments. Both of those seem awesome, and the Jump Canoness genuinely looks like it could be a credible choice if you've got good stratagems to use with them, presuming that you don't want to save her for the Zephyrim, which might be the better synergy overall given melee. Still hard to go wrong with a unit or two of Seraphim for secondary objective support though, particularly with the Pariah Nexus update now. Next up, at 60 points pre-Codex, we had the Zephyrim, again a similar stat line to the Seraphim. They also get the 5+ invulnerable save for a boosted Shield of Faith. These ones are the melee version of the Sisters, with 3 attacks at Strength 4, AP 2 and Damage 1 on the power weapons, as well as access to that Canoness. They got themselves an interesting boosted damage rule, swapping out the previous embodied prophecy that they had. Now at the start of each fight phase, whether they're charged or not, they get to choose either sustained or lethal hits for their blades, lethal hits being pretty great for anything that you're wounding on a 5+, and if you happen to have both made a charge roll and are happy to expend 1 junk miracle dice, then you can get both of those at once if you want to make them hit really hard for a turn. Finally, they still get their sacred banner to re-roll advance and charge rolls to get where they need to be fast. Again, they feel like they've got a lot of good options for fighty things in the detachments. Both the AP and Lance stratagems are rather nice in Army of Faith, and they can also use the jump pack stratagems, and there's some fun stuff for them in Hallowed Martyrs as well, things like the protect from combat or the reroll hits in melee. Next up, we've got the Sisters Repentia, again a unit that had been decreased to a very low points cost compared with where they started in 10th edition, 55 points per 5 or 110 per 10. These lightly armoured Penitent Sisters with Eviscerators move 7 inches but don't get power armor saves. They're reliant on their 6+ invulnerable save and then their 5+ feel no pain to shrug a bit of damage. Their Penitent Eviscerators hit with 2 attacks each, hitting on a 4+ at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2, and they got 2 buffs in the Codex. They get sustained hits on those Eviscerators all the time, so a nice boost in damage compared with where they were. And whenever you make a melee attack, you get to re-roll the hit roll and re-roll the wound roll. There's no stipulation that you need to charge to get the wound bit now. They also get the Penitent keyword, and you can still take them in squads of 5 or 10 models. I was wondering whether that option might be removed with the previous combat patrol, but it seems that Games Workshop still allows you to field them in 5s for now. I mentioned these quite a bit in multiple different detachments. Obviously they're kind of obscene in the Penitent Host, absolutely dangerous and huge threat ranges. Still great for stratagems that give them things like extra AP or Lance when they charge into melee as well. The combo with the Palatine in the Penitent Host does seem very scary. Next up, we've got the Sisters in Training in the Sisters Novitiate Squad. These are OC2 sort of scouty sisters armed with their fun melee relic weapons. The regular sisters get a 4+ save rather than a 3+. They don't really do all that much damage between a few fun pistols, a Ministorum Flamer, and then a bunch of strength 4 AP 0 attacks in melee. But they get to reroll hit rolls of 1 innately and all hit rolls against things on objectives, so they certainly could bully a bit of enemy light infantry chaff. They also get the Sacred Banner for rerolling advance and charge rolls, and a Simulacrum for the chance to farm miracle dice. The big thing that these girls got though was the Infiltrators keyword, so they can set up in the midfield. Really quite a big deal for Sisters of Battle who haven't usually had access to that. And it does mean that including at least one unit of these could be a really big deal. It's handy enough to have a Simulacrum in the midfield or just holding a midfield objective with a bunch of OC2 right from the word go, but in some matchups where the opponent's really big on infiltrators or scout moves, it could literally hold back half their army. Overall feels like they'll be a pretty interesting pick. I feel like we'll probably see a few more of them in competitive lists. Next up, we've got the Arco-Flagellants. They can still be fielded in 3s or 10s. Pre-Codex, they were 50 points or 160 per 10, though it seems that contrary to most of the trend of travel for the rest of the Codex, they've actually been toned down in power. They still move quite fast at 7 inches, don't have a normal save, but get a feel no pain type save and 2 wounds, and they hit the enemy with 6 attacks if they trigger their hazardous keyword extremist trigger word. So 6 attacks with Arco Flails with sustained hit, hitting on a 4 plus at strength 5, AP 0 and damage 1. The nerfs they took though were that those Arco Flails no longer have twin linked. Previously with that they were basically just stacking a crazy amount of saves on pretty much anything in the game, being able to flail off really quite a lot of wounds even off big tough things. As well as that, they're not quite as durable as they were either, the feel no pain dropping from a 5 plus to a 4 plus. Between the two it really is quite a nerf to their utility overall. I feel like at the 50 or 160 points they were actually fairly well balanced. Probably if anything could do with a points drop to make up for that a little bit versus some of the rest I suspect. I still don't think they'd be absolutely awful though. They still have a lot of efficiency against anything that's toughness 5 or less. They'll still absolutely love the Penitent Host, but unless they go down in cost, they've definitely lost a fair bit of power here. Moving on to vehicle units, and next up we have the Paragon Warsuits. These were 170 points before, and a fairly common competitive staple. On the datasheet, Games Workshop has actually given them some pretty massive boosts here, which makes me think that it'll probably come with a points rise as well, as they were already very good before. On their toughness, they gained toughness 7 up from toughness 6, and then both their melee weapons hit a fair bit harder. The Paragon Warblades were strength 6, but now they're strength 8. 4 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 2 is very scary, and the War Mace gets you 3 attacks at strength 12, AP 1, damage 3. That one hits on a 3 plus now rather than the 4 it was before. The high strength of that can make it really quite good for tank shock, otherwise people usually pair that with multi-melters and maybe a grenade launcher on the top, and they're already really quite a nice danger unit, particularly if you throw Morven Val and her big rerolls into the mix. On top of all that though, they picked up a pretty awesome special rule. They get Righteous Paragons, +1 to hit and wound against monsters and vehicles, whether it's shooting or fighting. I guess that's certainly one way to make multi-melters genuinely a massive threat against vehicles without support. I feel like with that kind of thing going on, you'd barely need Miracle Dice or Morven Val. They're just going to be shredding vehicles and monsters anyway. It replaces their fallback shoot and charge thing that they had previously, which did feel like it was a slightly niche special rule. Overall, these things are just massively more dangerous and slightly tougher. As a result, I feel like they're probably going to be a more points expensive, slightly glass cannon type unit, but certainly a unit that's going to make a big impact whether it's ranged or melee, and if they can get both in a turn, they could hit with a massive bang. Next up, we've got the Agonizing Mortifiers, 55 point little walkers pre-Codex, a very light vehicle profile, moving 8 inches, 5 wounds at toughness 6 with a 5 plus feel no pain, and generally they run towards the enemy blazing away with heavy bolters and then attack in melee with a bunch of their different combat options. A lot of people quite liked the twin boss blades for some twin linked attacks that work quite well against tough stuff. They picked up the Penitent keyword for use in that detachment, and then overall got a buff beyond that. All of their melee weapons have sustained hits now. Previously it was just sustained hits on the charge, and they replaced their Anguish of the Unredeemed special rule with a new one which is Fights on Death on a 2+. Quite nasty if the enemy needs to kill these in melee, I guess. The only nerf that they had to the datasheet was a small one to the Anchorite Sarcophagus. That one still gives you the 3+ save. I still think it's probably worth having. It does slow down that individual model's movement to a 7-inch move though, so it does come with a small trade-off now. I was also wondering whether or not they'd change the Mortifier Flamers in some way. It still seems that you get 2 of them though, and both of those get twin linked, so both these and the Penitent engines are still very savage up close. Speaking of which, the Penitent engines are the other version of the datasheet. The stat line's almost exactly the same, they also have sustained hits though they had that before. They just trade off a bit of raw hitting power for a bit of advance and charge action. They can't take heavy bolters and their melee only hits on a 4+. However, they trade out the Fights on Death for the assault keyword on their flamers and the Endless Suffering special rule, which means they can advance and charge. It means that they have an average charge threat range of around about 18 or so inches, potentially more in the Penitent Host, or if you plug an Act of Faith dice into the advance or charge roll. Overall, they feel hard to go too far wrong with, just maybe need to make sure that they hit the enemy before you get hit yourselves. Next up, we've got a bit of holy armor in the Exorcist. Pre-Codex, this was 180 points, though still just about usable. The missile weapons have had a bit of a side grade. Previously, they had the heavy keyword that's now gone, so they can't use that to mitigate the -1 to hit for barrage fire. So that is a downgrade there, but on the plus side, both of the gun profiles did actually get buffed a bit. The conflagration rockets went from strength 5 AP0 to strength 6 AP1, and they still ignore cover. Though in reality, I feel like most people are still taking the Exorcist missile launcher for a very scary D6 plus 2, strength 10 AP3 and damage D6 hits. It's an indirect profile that most units are going to really feel if they get hit by it, particularly if you help it out with miracle dice in some way. Obviously, its overall efficiency is going to be really dependent on its points cost. Artillery does feel very sensitive to that, and otherwise it's had a bit of a switch around for its special rule. Previously, it was an aura of better leadership. Now it triggers a battle shock test against enemies that were hit by it, and if it destroys anything that has deadly demise, it'll trigger on a 5+ rather than a 6, so a bit more of a chance to blow up some enemies in their own ranks. Still not really a super impactful special rule on either account at the moment though. Overall, still potentially very interesting, just as an artillery piece that can hit very, very hard. Next up, we've got the Castigator, an 11 wound toughness 10 tank with a 3+ save similar to the Exorcist. This one's basically the Sister's Predator tank with a choice of either a battle cannon or an autocannon on the top, and then 3 heavy bolters to help support. These have been good since the edition started, more people tending to take the battle cannon over the autocannon, primarily due to the ignores cover. Both of them are at least fairly well balanced though. The autocannon can get more shots at close range and get twin linked, which is kind of nice. Previously there were some rerolls differentiating the two of them, but it seems that both of those have gone away now. In their place, its new Rites of Castigation rule is an AP debuff. You get to nominate one unit hit by the Castigator, and then for the rest of the phase, any other Sisters units that shoot that same target will get an extra AP1 against the same thing. Could be particularly helpful for other Castigators, to be honest, with their kind of low AP being their biggest weakness. They're certainly handy for any flamers or maybe occasionally even melter weapons out there if you happen to be targeting something really big and nasty like a Land Raider with Armor of Contempt. Still seems kind of nice. If you're running the battle cannon, I guess it's lost the rerolls to hit against monsters and vehicles now, which is one downside. I think that AP debuff is really quite an interesting rule and definitely strong enough to be helpful. Next up, we've got the fiery transport of the Immolator, 115 points pre-Codex, a similar sort of chassis to the Exorcist and the Castigator, except it goes 12 inches rather than 10. You get the choice between 3 different top guns, either multi-melters, immolation flamers, or a twin heavy bolter. I'd probably say the multi-melters are the most interesting, though the flamers are nice as well. Perhaps one of the more interesting things about the Immolator is it's one way to get smaller units of Sisters of Battle. If you have a Battle Sister squad or a Dominion or Novitiate squad, then you can have 5 in this and then 5 deployed elsewhere. That does genuinely have quite a lot of value just in itself. Otherwise though, its special rule has been changed. It was quite a good one in that it allowed reroll wound rolls for units getting out of it if you targeted the same thing. Now it's been changed to stripping the benefit of cover from its target that it shot, which I think still is really quite an impactful rule and it will help out a bit, but it isn't quite as big as the easy to use reroll wound rolls. Overall still seems interesting though. I'm sure it'll be quite a good one for the Bringers of Flame, moving around the board very fast, handing out some big damage with multi-melters, maybe at strength 10, and having a trio of different interesting transport stratagems to support it. Next up, for 75 points, we've got the No Frills transport in the Sororitas Rhino. As with rhinos elsewhere, it's cheap and effective and does the job well. Sisters of Battle tend to get on very well with it, given that they've got multiple units that are really quite fragile but hard hitting. The exact sort of thing that you want a rhino to deliver them in place to deal their damage and not get shot before. It's particularly the choice if you want any big 10 squads transporting, maybe 10 Repentia or Arco-Flagellants perhaps, and as with other rhinos it's got lots of nice advantages, some Storm Bolters and a Hunter-Killer missile, a firing deck and healing wounds and things. Seems like a nice choice for a lot of units. I'd say Repentia might be the single unit I'd be most tempted by though. Next up, we get on to the generic characters of the Adepta Sororitas, and then we'll move on to the epic heroes after. As I've already mentioned a couple of times, the Canoness was one of the units that got interesting changes. You get 3 battle tactic stratagems, and that's in place of the reroll hit rolls. As mentioned, they maybe feel best for Army of Faith and the Bringers of Flame out of the detachments. Otherwise, you had a few war gear changes as well. given that she already does some command point things now. The Rod of Office that she can take now allows reroll hit rolls of 1 for the bearer's unit, though you do have to give up some other weapons for that. And you'd have to give up the Blessed Blade, which got buffed. That was previously 3 attacks and now it's 4, all at strength 6, AP 2 and damage 2 with lethal hits, so a fair bit punchier than she was previously. Otherwise, really quite a lot of other good options, including the Brazier of Holy Fire for a big one-shot flame attack, or the Null Rod for some psychic defense. I'd probably be most tempted by the Rod of Office or the Blessed Blade though, and she still has that supporting rule for a once per game 2+ invulnerable save for a phase, which should allow her to survive even if her squad gets wiped, but you just need to make sure that you trigger it at the start of the phase. She can also lead Retributors or Sisters Novitiate as well, so it's gained a few more options there. Though Phil might be better at home with Dominion scouting forward or Celestian Sacrosancts and actually having a bit more melee threat. Next up we've got the Palatine, the Sisters Lieutenant effectively. She's the one that brings the lethal hits on 6s to the unit, and otherwise is a cheapish support character with 4 wounds now rather than 3, and a plasma pistol and 4 attacks with a strength 4 and damage to Palatine Blade. For her datasheet changes in the Codex, she can lead Retributors now, which is kind of interesting to get lethal hits on multi-melters, I suppose. Could be fun with any other damage dealing enhancements like in the Bringers of Flame. She lost the innate Scout 6 inches, though Dominions can now give that to anyone provided they're within a transport at the same time. And otherwise, she still has that rule where if you discard a miracle dice, each time you score a wound, you do an additional mortal wound to the enemy, and that could make her very fighty. People often liked to take the Blade of St. Eleanor in the previous index, and that's still basically an option under another name. Pretty interesting in other things as well, like that combo with Repentia in the Penitent Host. Next up, for some support characters, we have the Hospitaller. The Sister's Medic is a 3 wound support character, nothing enormous in terms of damage threat, but now she's got 2 fairly good defensive rules rather than 1. She still has the 5+ feel no pain for her unit, which is alright, though maybe not enormously stand out on 1 wound infantry, as it gets a bit negated if they get hit by anything that's damage 2 or better. But now she also has a fun one called Sacred Healing, so restoring slain models to the unit. She can do so each command phase if her squad is damaged but not destroyed, and if you sacrifice her a miracle dice, then she'll heal D3+1 slain models, which would be really quite a big swing and a whole load of value returned. I guess probably the biggest awkward thing for her is trying to find a unit that is going to take damage but not be completely wiped out. That could be a bit of a risk with some of the sisters. I feel like at 35 points you might well be worth that risk now, though for the most part in terms of fragile glass cannon units you often want things that can up the damage output as opposed to try and mitigate bad defense. Next up, for 45 points pre-codex, we've got the Dog Martyr, kind of like the Sister's Chaplain if anything. A 3 wound support character with some fairly good melee with the Mace of the Righteous. 4 attacks at strength 5, AP 2 and damage 2 should hurt some Space Marines. The AP has been buffed since AP 1 in the index. Otherwise she's fairly unchanged. She gets an extra OC for all the models in her unit. She gives your unit a 6+ leadership, which will help prevent them failing as much, and debuffs enemy leadership at the same time, worsening morale by -1 for them. The wording of that has been changed a bit. She actually worsens their leadership characteristic as opposed to debuffing rolls on leadership and battle shock tests, though I guess the effect would be the same most of the time. Like a few of the other sister support characters, she can join a battle sister squad at the same time as a Canoness, Palatine or Junith Arita, and that list has also been expanded to Eastrid Thurger now. So that's just for the standard battle sister squad, not for some of the more exciting, dangerous variants. Next up, we've got the Imagifier, the support character with the great big standard banner type thing. 35 points pre-codex, and the main thing that she adds for her unit is a better defense. Previously, it was just a 4+ invulnerable save, and it was only if she was with Celestian Sacrosancts that she gave them a 2+ save. Though now literally any sister squad that she joins gets a 4+ invulnerable save and a 2+ regular save. It does mean that you could make some perhaps surprisingly tanky Dominions or standard battle sisters that aren't just going to fold to the first flurry of AP0 fire. Otherwise, with a bit of recounting the deeds of the fallen, if any sisters units die within 12 inches, you get to re-roll the miracle dice before you add it to the pool. Could be helpful enough to maybe get a few more high rolls out there. That might depend on her being in a useful position on the board. Next up, we've got the Dialogus, a very cheap 30-point support character pre-Codex, though quite an interesting one I think. Again, a 3-wound character without any real damage of her own. Her changes were gaining a 4+ invulnerable save in the Codex, gives a leadership 6+, and in the Codex has swapped her Codex ability that allowed you to use Stratagems if battle shocked for a once per game cancel battle shock ability, which triggers on one unit within 12 inches at the start of any phase. That ability can occasionally be useful, but most of the time it isn't really that good. It can't usually score your primary objectives, as there's no time to trigger it between failing the battle shock and then scoring the points. Her best ability is the Stirring Rhetoric rule though. While the model is leading a unit, each time the model's unit performs an act of faith, the result of one of the miracle dice of the act of faith is changed to a 6. That seems pretty massive in the Army of Faith, where you could be getting 2 6s in a row into your unit, all in one big strike, most likely with a multi-melter. Say she was with a standard Battle Sister squad. If you managed to get one hit with a melter weapon, then provided your target had a save of say 3+ or worse, you could auto wound with the melter weapon and then punch through an automatic 6 damage, potentially 8 damage from a single melter shot, and all you'd have to do would be to hit. There's plenty of other potentially fun combos, and she can run with a bunch of other units as well, but probably an interesting one to watch in the Army of Faith, I'd guess. Finally, for the generic characters, we've got the Minister and Priest. Pre-Codex, depending on the variant of them, they were 35 points or 45. The one printed is apparently 40, though I guess we'll wait and see where they wind up. The Priest is a 3-wound support character with a 4+ invulnerable save, and it's got 2 different war gear options, a Holy Pistol and Power Weapon, or the Zealot's Vindictor. The Vindictor seems like easily the best one, 3 attacks at Strength 5, AP 1 and Damage 2 in melee, and then basically a Minister and Flamer sort of attack at range, so maybe not awful damage for a fairly cheap character. Once per game on top of that, you also get to increase your strength and attack characteristics of weapons equipped by the model by 3. That's gone up from 2 since the index, so potentially 6 attacks at strength 8 in melee for one turn is pretty massive. And that will usually be at +1 to wound as well from righteous smiting that the priest gives its unit, and that's the main helpful buff. The +1 to wound seems really quite nice for the Arcoflagellants, and that can be the character that can bear them the 5+ invulnerable save relic in Penitent Host. But the Minister and Priest also seems to have got a special rule called Holy Mission, meaning that if you attach to a Dominion squad, they can still scout even if not in their transport, and if attaching to a Sisters Novitiate unit, then they gain Infiltrate. To be honest, it almost seems a bit suspect just how much support they've given the Minister and Priest, given that they've got a new model launching for it, or at least a rebranding of the old model that they had from Blackstone Fortress. I feel like in reality though, you're probably going to want some value out of that +1 to wound roll, so that's probably going to be Arcoflagellants if anything. Now they don't have twin linked on their melee attacks, that seems a lot more useful, so I'd guess that probably as running with them it is best, plus chipping in a few attacks with higher strength and damage. Finally, for the sisters, we've got their epic heroes. First up, we've got Morven Var, Mrs. High Lord of Terror herself. She's still got a fairly impressive stat line, toughness 7 now, up from 6 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable, and a big 8 wounds. Quite a powerful character that you could resurrect from death with that stratagem in the Hallowed Martyrs. She attacks with a 2-shot Paragon missile launcher that's similar to crack missiles elsewhere, and Fidelis a heavy bolter with strength 6. In melee she swings with the Lance of Illumination, 5 attacks at strength 8, AP 2 and damage 3 with devastating wounds, or 10 attacks at strength 5, AP 1, damage 1. Again, that's also been upgraded to devastating wounds now. With all of those attacks, she's usually going to be re-rolling the hit rolls and the wound rolls if she's leading Paragon warsuits, thanks to her Abbess rule. So she is absolutely godly for Paragon warsuits buffs. They look like they'd be absolutely terrifying with her now against monsters and vehicles, even just with the multi-melter damage output. You'd be wounding most every vehicle on a 4+ re-rolling the wound roll, and then hitting with almost every hit. Finally, her Righteous Repugnance rule has been rewritten quite a bit. Now, rather than just having a single free turn where she gets +3 attacks, you now have to pay for that with a miracle dice, but you can now do it multiple times per game, and if she slays anything personally, then you gain 1 new miracle dice to add to your pool. Maybe a bit of a side grade that one, previously you didn't have to pay anything, but I guess being able to do it turn on turn could be quite big if you do have the low dice miracle things to spare, and occasionally she might generate 1 back. Overall, still looks very scary, if anything, a bit stronger than before, given some more devastating wounds, higher strength, and potentially hitting multiple times with that boosted profile. With Paragon Warsuits, she's going to cause a massive amount of damage to the enemy, though already they're not super tough against high AP anti-tank weapons. I can't help but think with all the buffs that they've got, they might get a points increase. Next up, Junitha Rita is a unit that got a whole bunch of changes. She's the Canoness flying around on her horror pulpit. Her base stats all got a fair bit better. She's 8-inch move now with 8 wounds and a toughness of 5, still with that 2+ save and -1 to hit. She's really quite tough in her own right now, to the point where you could probably field her completely solo unless her points go up a bit. She can still be attached to units though. She can lead Battle Sisters, Celestian Sacrosancts, and now Dominions, Retributors, and Novitiates as well, which are new options. Though otherwise she's taken 2 nerfs beyond that. She's got the mounted keyword rather than infantry, which probably makes sense given the size of that pulpit thing that she's flying around in. And now she previously used to generate you 1 command points just automatically, but now she'll only do that if you either pass a leadership test or are willing to discard a miracle dice to ensure it. I guess depends on just how much value you have on low roll miracle dice versus the small chance that she's going to fail. I'd probably take the leadership test most of the time, really. Overall, a kind of interesting mixed offering there. She also gets a twin heavy flamer and a bunch of strength 6 mace of castigation attacks in melee. The extra command points might be one of the biggest selling points, but then otherwise she's just a big, relatively tanky, relatively dangerous leader to go marching up the board. Next up, we've got Saint Celestine herself, 135 points pre-Codex, and she is relatively unchanged. She comes as a mini unit with her 2 Gemini. She gets 5 wounds herself, and the Gemini get 2 each. They're all toughness 3 with a 2+ save and a 4+ invulnerable. She gets an AP -2 Ministorum Heavy Flamer sort of attack with the Ardent Blade, and then a bunch of Strength 6 AP3 and Damage 2 attacks in melee, all with devastating wounds. Really quite nice for slaying Space Marine equivalents. She can lead Seraphim and Zephyrim or just go flying around all by herself. She is kind of unusually tanky given her ability to get back up on death. The first time that she's slain on a 2+, she gets back up with 4 wounds remaining. The small buff that she got was to model regeneration. Previously she could just heal 1 bodyguard model, whether it was a Gemini or something else. Now she can either restore 1 Gemini from the dead or heal D3 other bodyguard models, so you could put a good chunk of Seraphim or Zephyrim back on the table. Overall, she's not really super high damage, but can be really quite disruptive from moving fast and those annoying regeneration type rules. Over the course of a game, she could swoop around picking off a few smaller lighter infantry type units, and maybe causing more problems than she's worth for enemies going after her. If you want actual leaders, say for Zephyrim though, then I feel like that jump Canoness is looking very nice if she does stay 50 points. Next up, for the biggest, most complicated, and also perhaps one of the weirdest datasheets out there, is the Triumph of St. Catherine. It's still a slightly bizarre and all very cool and holy funeral procession, with the infantry keyword but a big 18 wounds all on one base, and then gets to pick up 2 of its favourite relics each turn to be able to give auras to nearby Sisters of Battle to help you out. Otherwise, in melee, they hit with a whole bunch of power weapon style attacks, 18 attacks hitting on a 2+ at strength 5, AP2, damage 1, so enough to bully lighter infantry, though damage isn't really its main thing. For the buffs it got a very powerful additional rule just thrown in with Solemn Procession. In each command phase, you just generate 1 miracle dice of a 6 at the start of each battle round. Really helpful to have those there. Getting a particularly highly useful miracle dice is a massive advantage. Otherwise, beyond that, 4 out of its 6 previous buffing rules were rewritten to one extent or another. The Fiery Heart swapped from miracle dice of slain units to become 6s, to an aura of boosted movement. You get +2 to your move and +1 to advance and charge. It does mean that you could have some melee sisters going up the board incredibly quickly there. Could be yet another thing to make things like Repentia faster in the Penitent Host, but it's handy enough regardless. The Sacred Rose might be one of the more tame ones, a 6-inch aura of reroll Battle Shock, not really worth it unless it's endgame and you absolutely need to pass those tests. Previously that was +1 leadership, so it's not really like you've lost much. If anything, that's a boost there. The Argent Shroud gives you a 6-inch aura of reroll wound rolls of 1 at range. I feel like that would come up if you put it in the middle of a firebase, but maybe not quite enough to justify the Triumph all by itself. I guess interesting enough that you could have that on Castigator tanks, throwing down a lot of firepower. Bloody Rose gives you a 6-inch aura of +1 AP in melee. Previously that was an aura of lethal hits in melee. I feel like they're both good rules. It kind of depends on what exactly you were fighting. I feel like overall for boosting its own ability, maybe the lethal hits was probably the better of the two though. And then that sticks with the two that it had before. The aura of Sisters of Battle being able to use 2 acts of faith per phase rather than 1, similar to the full army rule for the Army of Faith, and the 6+ Feel No Pain type aura, which is generally fairly helpful, though maybe not super impactful if it's 1 wound infantry that you're affecting. Overall, between that little lot, there's a lot of good things on offer here. The extra farmed miracle dice is immense extra value. If it stays at a relatively similar points cost, I could see it being run in a lot more army lists again. The miracle dice plus all the good stuff it already had seems great. Next up, we've got the Anti-Chaos Demonifuge in Ephrael Stern and Carganel. They're the Sisters' lone operatives, with 3 wounds on Carganel and 5 wounds on Ephrael. And for lone operatives, they move quite fast and are fairly punchy in close combat. Ephrael gets 4 attacks at Strength 6, AP 2, Damage 2 with Anti-Chaos and Precision. Carganel a flurry of attacks with Strength 4, AP 2 and Damage 1. Previously that was AP -1, so a small melee boost there. Nice enough in that they can threaten smaller squads of infantry, plus they get fights first, so should take a chunk out of things that charge them. Otherwise they get free heroic intervention, which occasionally might come up, and a rule to try and throw some mortal wounds against enemies, the chance for 3 mortal wounds if you fail a battle shock test, subtracting 2 from the result if it's chaos. Previously that was just a leadership test, so I guess he gets the battle shock debuff as a bonus now. They were ones that went down in points cost at the last points update. I feel like they did kind of need it a little bit, really. Fairly tanky and somewhat threatening lone operatives that are fairly fast are just generally handy to have in 40k though, almost regardless of what exactly they do. I feel like there's definitely enough interest here, and occasionally they might just run into a situation that's the perfect thing that they can handle. Heroic intervention might surprise people as well, particularly in combo with fights first. Finally, one of the more underwhelming datasheets in the Codex got a lot more interest in Astrid Thurger and Agathe Dolan, a pair of characters in a Relic Bearer and Soothsayer. Astrid is a 2+ save 4 wound character, and Agathe is a 3 wound one with just a 4+ invulnerable save to protect her. Astrid is the one that does most of the fighting, with 4 attacks at strength 5, AP 2, and damage 2. The biggest buff from the auto tapestry of the Emperor's Judgment is now that you get devastating wounds on the units both at range and in melee, and they can join Battle Sister squads, Celestian Sacrosants, Dominion squads, Retributors, or Novitiates. Celestian Sacrosants might look like a bit more of an interesting option again, now their -1 to wound thing actually works with Astrid and Agatha around, plus they've got some more threatening weapons. I guess having a devastating wound multi-melter definitely has potential as well. You could put a miracle dice into that, you could even have them in the same unit as a Dialogus if you wanted. Potentially that could be punching through pretty much automatic damage even against things with good invulnerables. Finally, Agatha does have a bit more value in herself as well. You generate 1 miracle dice whenever their unit slays another one, plus Agatha, when slain, generates D3 miracle dice. So quite a good consolation prize for if the unit does get wiped out, though obviously that's not really ideal. Previously they were 55 points, and if they stay somewhere near that, then it feels like quite a lot of value that you're getting out of these two here. I feel like most of the squads don't really feel like they're ideally suited to them really. Certainly throwing out a bunch more devastating wounds on a unit really feels like a bad thing though. Overall, that's really quite a spectacular amount of buffs to datasheets compared with some of the other codexes that we've seen in 10th edition so far. We've definitely had a lot of Imperial armies that weren't as lucky, broadly getting nerfs across the board. I feel like there was a lot of foreign excitement added here, and I feel like this was a pretty interesting codex release. It just makes people a bit more positive about their models if they're all getting a bit stronger and scarier in one way or another, even if that does wind up getting balanced out by points. I think one of the things that I liked seeing the most was a lot of the non-impactful unit rules being changed to something that actually was a bit more use in game, plus a few interesting stat line boosts here and there. For the most part, the army does feel like it's skewing further towards more damage than defense, and sisters already tend to be a little bit more glass cannon, but maybe that's not the worst thing in the world. I definitely feel like when 10th edition came out, one of the main complaints was that the vast majority of their index couldn't really do that much against big tough stuff, and they had to rely on things like exorcists and castigators in big numbers. The detachments all look really good fun as well though. I genuinely think that Sisters players are kind of spoilt for choice, and the Hallowed Martyrs definitely isn't bad either, with its good stratagems and a few good enhancements. The Army of Faith and Bringers of Flame do have some excellent support stuff though, and provided Repentia and Arco-Flagellants and Penitent engines all wind up as actually fairly efficient datasheets, the Penitent Host certainly can make them do some fairly obscene things. It'll be really interesting to see what good competitive players make of the Codex and what sort of lists start to do well in events when we get the points out. Talking of which, at least at first impressions, my guess would be that there will be some points rises coming in the changes for them. At the moment, Sisters of Battle really aren't doing badly in Warhammer 40k. At tournaments, they've got a 52% win rate, with the vast majority of their index being at least playable competitively. And then throughout this codex, there's been just a massive amount of datasheets that have gained loads of power, and a whole bunch of fun detachments which look like they have some very nasty combos in and might add a further layer of power beyond that. For that reason, I would guess that Games Workshop will probably put up a few points cuts, as if not, they'd probably be the single strongest army in the game. I feel like between the buffed units and some of the incredibly nasty things in the detachment, that's probably not overstating things. Even if a few points costs did go up to compensate though, that's not necessarily a bad thing at all. I think it's far better to have foreign impactful detachments and units that hit hard and feel dangerous on the table versus the opposite. Feels like maybe Games Workshop might have learned a thing or two from their reception of the AdMech Codex and actually tried to make their Sisters Elite infantry feel genuinely elite and something to be afraid of. Overall looks pretty good though. Let me know your thoughts on the codex down in the comments below, and feel free to let me know if I've missed anything or made any mistakes. I'll try and post a pinned comment below if I notice anything important. If you've been enjoying the videos on the channel, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. I'm sure I'll have a few more things for the Sisters of Battle over the next few weeks. Hopefully I'll try and make a unit tier list once we get points costs. Finally, if you have been enjoying the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support and keep all these videos coming. All the content, and particularly these enormous codex reviews, take an enormous amount of time and effort to make, and if you have got any good value out of them, any support on there is enormously appreciated. Channel patrons do get a few rewards, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things come next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.